Throughout his life, Isaac faced trials, saw his family divided, and learned that trusting in God means relinquishing control but never faith. Let's explore the story of this man who discovered that true strength comes from peace, and that God's promises, though mysterious, never fail. Subscribe to the channel to watch more exciting Bible stories, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Abraham was sitting in front of his tent when he heard the unexpected. God himself assured him that, even at 100 years old, he would have a son. Sarah, his wife, already desperate and 90 years old, laughed upon hearing that promise. It was no surprise. Old age had drained her strength, and years of waiting without results had hardened her heart. Abraham, on the other hand, carried within him a faith no one understood, a silent certainty that grew stronger each day. He lifted his gaze to the starry sky, remembering the divine covenant that his descendants would be as numerous as the lights floating above the desert. Then, after a long time, when the promise already seemed like a legend, it happened. The news that Sarah was expecting a child swept through the camp like a sudden wind. With each passing day, her belly grew, and with it the anxiety and reverence of the entire household. Abraham watched his wife change, smile in a way he never imagined seeing again, and at last the moment arrived. At birth, the child was named Isaac, which means laughter, a name full of meaning, for it was the joy that God had sown among them. Isaac grew up surrounded by care and protected by a special feeling, a purpose no one could fully explain, but everyone could sense. Each day, Abraham looked at the child and he felt the weight of the responsibility that came with that promise. It was as if Isaac was more than just a son. He was a living sign of God's faithfulness. From a young age, Isaac felt the weight of a promise looming over him, even though he did not truly understand what it meant. His father, Abraham, often spoke to him about the covenant with God, about the stars in the sky that would one day symbolize his descendants. Isaac listened attentively, impressed, but still far from understanding what all of this would demand of him. In that home marked by faith, Isaac grew up alongside his mother, Sarah, and his half-brother, Ishmael. However, things began to change when Sarah, realizing the rivalry between Isaac and Ishmael, felt the need to protect her son. She feared that the chosen child might be affected by living with Ishmael, and over time, she convinced Abraham to send Hagar and his brother away. Isaac watched with sadness as Ishmael left. It was the first sign that his path would be different. It was a lonely, unusual path, marked by invisible responsibilities, but ones he could already feel. After Ishmael's departure, life went on, and Isaac once again became the center of Sarah and Abraham's care. Abraham looked at him as if there were a constant expectation in the air, something that only he and Sarah knew, but never spoke out loud. Isaac, in turn, grew increasingly curious about the special purpose that everyone seemed to see in him. He did not know that his faith and courage would be tested in ways no child could ever imagine. The sky was beginning to brighten when Abraham called Isaac for a long journey to Mount Moriah. For the young boy, the trip seemed normal. He had already accompanied his father in sacrifices and rituals, moments when Abraham built altars and offered animals to God. But that morning, the father's face was heavier, as if he were holding a secret he could not share. With an axe in his hand and the wood for the altar on his shoulders, Isaac walked beside Abraham. With each step, the silence between them grew denser. They were already far from home when Isaac looked around and realized that something essential for the ritual was missing. the animal for the sacrifice. He hesitated before asking his father, but driven by curiosity and the strangeness of the situation, he finally asked, "Father, where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" Abraham, with a distant look, answered enigmatically, "God will provide the lamb, my son." Isaac, still not understanding, nodded, trusting his father's words, though a strange uneasiness began to fill his heart. When they finally reached the top of the mountain, Abraham prepared the altar, arranged the wood, and with a voice he could barely steady, called Isaac to bind him to the wood. Confused and afraid, Isaac obeyed, perhaps out of love and respect, perhaps because of an inexplicable trust he felt in Abraham. When he saw the gleam of the sword in his father's hands, Isaac closed his eyes and felt the anguish that ran through Abraham's soul. But before the sword could reach him, a voice echoed through the mountain, calling Abraham. The suspended sword halted in the air, and Abraham took a deep breath, feeling relief flood his chest. The divine voice had called him, interrupting the sacrifice. Still trembling, Abraham heard God's words telling him that his faith had been tested and that he would not need to sacrifice his own son. Isaac, still lying on the altar, opened his eyes, confused, and saw his father crying, untying the ropes with trembling hands. The two looked at each other, and at that moment, Isaac realized that his life did not belong only to him. There was something greater, a purpose he did not yet understand. They descended the mountain together, but the silence between them was now different. Isaac felt a mix of respect, fear, and admiration for his father, who had been willing to do the unthinkable in the name of his faith. And though questions echoed in his mind, he kept them to himself, accepting that, for now, some answers would remain a mystery. But Isaac's life was soon to change again. Sometime later, Sarah, his mother, fell ill, and her health began to slowly deteriorate. Isaac, with his deep eyes, watched her in silence, becoming more aware each day that her time was running out. He remembered moments with Sarah, the stories she used to tell him, and the protective love with which she surrounded him. On the day of her passing, the absence of his mother left a void that Isaac did not know how to fill. Now, with the weight of adulthood upon him and the mission of continuing Abraham's lineage, Isaac tried to cope with both his grief and his growing responsibilities. The mourning for his mother was still fresh when Isaac found himself facing a new reality. His father, now of advanced age, began speaking about the importance of finding him a wife. Isaac, still shaken by his loss, did not think about marriage, but Abraham knew that God's promise could not be fulfilled unless Isaac continued the lineage. With determination, Abraham called his trusted servant and sent him on a special mission to search in distant lands for a wife for the son of the promise. Isaac watched the servant depart, not knowing what to expect. Days passed, and he continued with his tasks, but his heart was restless. He knew that something important was about to happen. One evening, as he walked through the fields at dusk, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. It was as if, when he looked at the horizon, he could. He reached beyond what his eyes could see. There, alone with his thoughts, he realized the weight of his responsibility, the promise of God that rested upon his life. It was then that, in the distance, he saw a caravan approaching. Isaac's heart raced without him understanding why. As the caravan drew closer, he saw a young woman with her face covered, riding a camel, looking at him with curiosity. She dismounted, and he noticed that her eyes shone, reflecting a mixture of nervousness and charm. It was Rebecca, the woman chosen to be his companion. Without exchanging many words, they both felt that something special connected them. There was a lightness in her presence that brought comfort to Isaac's heart, a warmth he hadn't felt since the loss of Sarah. Rebecca was unlike anything he had known, brave, kind, and willing to embark on the same journey of faith that he had inherited from Abram. Their union was quickly sealed, as if both knew this encounter was not a mere coincidence. With Rebecca by his side, Isaac began to see that his path still had deep challenges, but now he would not face them alone. The years with Rebecca brought joy and stability to Isaac. He found in her a friend, a counselor, and a woman of faith. They shared tasks, dreams, and small everyday moments, always aware of the greater calling that united them. But as time passed, a silence began to grow between them. The days and nights stretched on, and Rebecca could not get pregnant. With each new year without a child, her concern grew. Isaac felt the weight of his legacy becoming stronger. He knew he was the heir to a great promise. How could this promise be fulfilled if she had no children to carry it out? When anxiety became a shadow in his home, Isaac turned to God and spent hours in prayer, asking for a miracle. He sought answers and strength, recalling the sacrifice on Mount Moriah and how God had been faithful at every moment in his life. Rebecca, though frustrated, shared the same faith and hope. Deep down, she knew that the desire to have a child was not only hers, but that of a whole people who would someday arise from this family. And then, when waiting seemed unbearable, the news came. Rebecca was pregnant, but this pregnancy would not be ordinary. Soon Rebecca noticed something strange within her. There was a constant struggle in her womb, as if the children were fighting for space and strength even before birth. Intrigued, Rebecca prayed, trying to understand what was happening. It was then that God revealed to her that two nations lived in her womb, and the older would serve the younger. This message brought her a mix of relief and apprehension, as she knew it would alter the course of the family forever. With a heart torn between the mystery and the promise, Isaac awaited the birth of his sons, unaware of the conflicts to come and how his own faith would again be tested. When the twins were finally born, Isaac and Rebecca realized from the very beginning how different their sons were. First came Esau, covered in hair, strong and impulsive, while Jacob, calmer, was born holding his brother's heel, as if already showing his cunning. As the years passed, the boys' personalities only accentuated these differences. Esau grew wild and free, a hunter who spent long hours in the field, away from home. Jacob, on the other hand, preferred to stay close to home, more reserved and careful, observing, learning from Rebecca. This division, however, created a delicate dynamic in the family. Isaac felt a special affection for Esau, admiring his strength and courage, seeing in him an extension of his own youth. Rebecca, in turn, became fond of Jacob, who shared her calmness and intelligence. This difference in parental affection sowed a subtle rivalry between the brothers, something Isaac seemed to ignore, perhaps because he believed that God's choices did not depend on these internal disputes. As they grew, Esau and Jacob not only competed, but also cultivated a resentment that they both disguised, each in their own way. One day, Esau returned exhausted from a hunt and found Jacob preparing a steaming stew arrogantly. The fatigue and hunger overcame Esau, who, without thinking twice, asked his brother for some food. Jacob, taking advantage of the situation, made an unexpected offer. He would give the stew, but in exchange, Esau would have to renounce his birthright. Esau, driven by urgency and impulse, agreed, trading his inheritance for a bowl of lentils. When Isaac found out about the exchange, he didn't think much of the agreement, considering it just a joke between brothers. He still saw Esau as the rightful heir, not imagining that this thoughtless exchange would lead to something much bigger, and that the destiny of his family would take an unexpected turn. As the years passed, the agreement between Esau and Jacob seemed like a distant memory, just a game between brothers. However, for Jacob, this was more than just an exchange. It was a silent promise that one day he would inherit the blessing and favor of God, regardless of being the younger son. And although Isaac didn't take seriously what had happened, he was approaching old age. Isaac, now with weak eyes and almost unable to see, decided that it was time to bless Esau with the birthright blessing. He called his son and asked him to go to the field and bring something home to eat. Then he would grant him the blessing of the inheritance. Esau, honored and excited, immediately left, unaware that Rebekah, who had been listening to the conversation, was already planning to interfere. She did not forget what God had revealed to her during her pregnancy, that the older would serve the younger. Rebekah was quick. She called Jacob and told him about his father's plan. She instructed him to disguise himself as Esau, placing goat skins on his arms to imitate his brother's hair, and dressing in his clothes so that Isaac would smell Esau's distinctive scent. Jacob, initially hesitant, followed his mother's instructions. They prepared a delicious dish, and Jacob entered Isaac's tent, saying in a firm voice, "Father, here I am. I am Esau." Isaac, confused by the familiar voice of Jacob, touched his son's arms and felt the roughness of the skin. Convinced that it was Esau, he offered the plate of food, and after eating, he laid his hands on Jacob, granting him the blessing that would ensure leadership and the continuation of God's promise. However, when Esau entered the tent, his exhausted hunter's face had not yet cooled. With a proud expression, he presented the dish he had prepared to his father, sure that the birthright blessing would soon be his. But when Isaac heard Esau's voice, he trembled, confused. It took him a moment to realize that something terrible had happened. "But who are you?" he asked, his voice weak and frightened. Esau, not understanding his father's reaction, replied, "It's me, Esau, your firstborn." Isaac, shocked, realized his mistake. The blessing that could not be revoked had been given to Jacob. Realizing that his brother had deceived him, Esau cried out in anger and pain, pleading with his father for a blessing as well. Isaac, devastated, murmured words of comfort, but he could not undo what had already been done. "Your brother came and deceived me," he said in a tone of sadness Esau had never heard before. Jacob stole the blessing. From that day on, Esau's hatred for Jacob turned into a vow of revenge. Isaac's peace was shattered. He saw, with great sorrow, how the bonds between his sons were unraveling, and he feared that this hatred would lead to irreversible tragedies. It was then that Rebekah, aware of the danger approaching, secretly called Jacob and advised him to flee to the land of his uncle Laban until Esau's anger calmed down. Before leaving, Jacob went to Isaac, who, despite everything, blessed him again, recognizing that God had a special purpose for him. The father looked at his son with a mixture of sadness and hope, understanding that Jacob's path would be solitary and full of trials. As Jacob departed, Isaac felt the weight of the farewell and a silent pain pressing on his chest. With Jacob exiled and Esau immersed in sorrow, Isaac decided to leave the confines of his tent in search of a new environment. He then moved with his family to Gerar, a land inhabited by the Philistines. The move was not just a matter of geography. Isaac sought peace in a place where he wouldn't have to relive, day after day, the conflicts between his children. In Gerar, life seemed promising, but Isaac soon faced difficulties. The land was dry, and finding water became a constant challenge. In search of sustenance, He began digging the wells that his father, Abraham, had dug long ago, wells that the Philistines had closed out of envy. Each well he reopened was a victory, a step forward to keep his family and servants safe and supplied. But every time he found water, the Philistine herdsmen would come to claim the well, saying that the land and the water belonged to them. Isaac, with his patience and peaceful temperament, did not seek conflict. Every time he was forced to abandon a well, he would leave and dig another, steadfast in his decision to avoid fighting. This cycle of digging wells and abandoning them seemed endless, but Isaac kept persevering, believing that eventually he would find a safe place where his family could thrive without disputes. Finally, after digging another well in a more distant valley, Isaac found peace. This time, the Philistines did not follow him, and he named the well Rehoboth, which meant wide place, because he felt that God had finally given him and his family a space where they could live in peace. It was a small triumph, but a triumph that brought him relief. It was then that, upon hearing of his prosperity, King Abimelech himself came to meet him. Before King Abimelech, Isaac remained calm, though the offer of peace surprised him. Abimelech, who had previously watched Isaac's silent battles for the wells with indifference, now saw something else. "We have seen that God is with you in everything you do," said the king, with genuine respect. Isaac listened attentively to Abimelech's words, and a silent relief filled his heart. He realized that his journey to Gerar, marked by patience and perseverance, had not only earned him the land, but also the respect of his former rivals. Isaac accepted the peace offering, and they sealed it with a meal, sitting side by side as friends. As they spoke, Isaac felt that this truce represented more than just an agreement. It was a sign of God's blessing on his life, even after all the conflicts. The table of peace they shared symbolized the long-awaited rest, and Isaac understood that his silent faithfulness had been his greatest victory. After the banquet, Abimelech bid farewell, leaving behind a promise of lasting peace. That very night, Isaac's servants arrived with news. They had dug a new well, and this time they found plenty of water. It was as if heaven had opened a path, pouring out upon the dry land the reward for his perseverance. Isaac called the well Beersheba, which means well of the oath, as a reminder of the covenant with Abimelech and God's provision in a time of need. From that moment on, Isaac lived in a phase of stability and growth, but even in the midst of this prosperity, he couldn't help but think of his distant sons, of the wounds still open between Esau and Jacob. In the later years of his life, Isaac watched over the great tent that had sheltered many generations, feeling the weight of time. God's blessing continued to be present in all that he did. The flocks grew, the harvests were abundant, and the servants worked with dedication. But even surrounded by prosperity, he couldn't escape the unease that arose whenever he thought of his sons. Since Jacob's departure, Isaac's house seemed to have lost something essential. Esau, though present, carried with him a bitterness that could not be erased. He had built his life there, married women, neighboring towns, but the resentment and anger of the past were still visible in his eyes. Isaac tried to maintain peace with him, but he knew the chasm between the brothers was deep. Isaac often wondered if he would ever see them both together again, as a family, but he couldn't predict what the future held. Isaac spent his days reflecting and remembering his own youth, the sacrifices made by Abraham, the promises of God on Mount Moriah, the silent love of Sarah, and the unexpected arrival of Rebekah. He saw the continuity of these stories in every detail around him, as if all the generations were connected by an invisible thread, held together by the same faith that had guided his steps from the beginning. As his strength waned, Isaac allowed himself to trust that even if he were not a witness to the reunion of his sons, God's promise would continue its course. He believed that just as God had sustained him through each challenge, he would also guide the steps of Jacob and Esau. leading them toward the promised future from the days of Abraham. And so, with a calm heart and eyes turned upward, Isaac rested, leaving as his inheritance the faith that would extend through generations. His legacy, intertwined in the paths of his children, would endure, and the stories of his life would continue to inspire us, reminding us that God's promises remain, even in the midst of life's struggles and uncertainties. The story of Isaac teaches us that true courage is not always shown in great feats or grand victories, but in quiet perseverance and the will to continue, even when the paths seem uncertain. One of Isaac's greatest lessons is the importance of waiting on God. For years, he waited for the blessing of a child with Rebekah, and even when it seemed impossible, he trusted that the promise would be fulfilled. Along his journey, he faced difficulties, such as conflicts with the Philistines and the rivalry of his own children, but he always chose peace. His story reminds us that we do not always have control over the events around us, but we can choose how to react to them. And in the end, he left a legacy based on loyalty, an inheritance passed down to Jacob, and through him, to an entire nation. Therefore, Isaac's life is a powerful reminder that God remains faithful. He not only guides the steps of those who trust in him, but also upholds every promise until the end. Struggles may come, distances may seem insurmountable, but like Isaac, we are called to trust, for what God promises, he always fulfills. If you enjoyed the story of Isaac and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, don't forget to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.